Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. On behalf of Bangalore International Mediation, Arbitration, Conciliation Center, I invite Mr. K.G. Raghavan, Senior Advocate, to deliver a talk on a very, very important topic. It's of great interest to most of us. Most of you do not require an introduction about Mr. Raghavan, but for those who do not know Mr. Raghavan has more than 4 decades of practice, is one of the leading senior counsels in India. He's been practicing in various courts, right from Supreme Court to several other courts, but we are proud that he's from Bangalore, from High Court of Karnataka, and brings today with him a lot of rich experience in the field of arbitration. This is the series of webinars that we have been conducting. This is the 5th, and there are going to be a few more, maybe in the near future. Without wasting much time, I'm sure Mr. Raghavan has got much to say. I welcome Mr. Raghavan to take over.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Thiruvengadam, for the nice words you said about me. It's indeed a privilege for me to be associated with you and BIMAC. I have always considered being part of BIMAC as a great learning experience for me. All branches of administration, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary have made concerted efforts over the last 2 decades to make arbitration as a popular alternate dispute resolution mechanism. Laws have been enacted. We repealed the old 1940 Arbitration Act and enacted the 1996 Arbitration and Conciliation Act in line with the UNCITRAL model law of arbitration. We have set up several arbitration centers in the country with the help of the legal fraternity and the government. And in addition, there have been number of judgments of the various high courts and the Supreme Court of India enunciating the law relating to arbitration with a view to advance the object of enacting this legislation and to make India an attractive destination for arbitration like Singapore, or for that matter, even Dubai. The arbitration law, which was enacted in 1996, underwent 2 substantial amendments, one in 2015 and the other in 2019. But the 2019 amendment has not yet been given effect to, and therefore, in the course of my presentation today, I shall confine my attention to the provisions of the 1996 Act as originally enacted and to the amendments that were carried out in 2016 by the Arbitration Amendment Act. Arbitration, as all of you are aware, is a consensual remedy. Both the parties have to agree on various aspects of arbitration before their dispute, whether it is existing or to arise in future to be decided by a arbitration process. What disputes should be decided by arbitration? What are accepted matters? Where should the arbitration be held? How should the arbitration be conducted, and what is the procedure to be adopted by the arbitral tribunal in the matter of conducting the arbitration? These are various aspects on which the parties can provide in the agreement. But according to me, the most crucial aspect which has to be provided in the arbitration agreement is what is technically known as the constitution of the arbitral tribunal. When we mention the term constitution of the arbitral tribunal, there are several aspects that come into play. One is, how many arbitrators should we have? Should it be a sole arbitrator, or should it be a multi-member arbitration tribunal? The issue becomes complicated and requires to be specifically provided in the arbitration agreement when it is a multi-party arbitration. That is, there are more than two parties to an agreement. The crucial aspect in the matter of constitution of the arbitral tribunal is with respect to the persons to act as arbitrators. In fact, in many of the agreements, unfortunately, there is little attention that is paid at the time when the agreement is signed, more particularly the arbitration clause, on this very crucial aspect of arbitration. Namely, if a dispute is to arise between the parties with regard to matters under the agreement, and the dispute is required to be settled by arbitration, who should the arbitrators be? There are various ways in which a provision can be made in an arbitration agreement with respect to the constitution of the arbitral tribunal. It is permissible that the parties, even at the time when they have entered into the main contract, which has an arbitration clause, to provide that any dispute that may arise amongst them in future should be referred to the arbitration or adjudication of a named person. That is one way in which the constitution of the tribunal can be provided for in an arbitration clause. The other method is to provide for the qualifications of the arbitrator. Should it be a technical arbitrator? Should it be an arbitrator with a legal background? Should it be an arbitrator with a background of the trade usage and customs relating to the agreement? Or should it be somebody who is within the family and who commands the respect and regard of the parties to the agreement? There can be a wide range of qualifications that can be provided in an arbitration clause, and it can also be an amalgamation of the various factors which I just now mentioned. Apart from providing the factors or the criteria for being appointed as an arbitrator under the agreement, one important and crucial aspect is that the arbitrator must be independent and impartial. We, as practitioners before arbitral tribunals, loosely refer, after the tribunal has been constituted, as nominee arbitrator. If it is a tribunal comprising of 3 arbitrators, there is a tendency to refer to the members of the arbitral tribunal as nominee arbitrators, and sometimes loosely, and I respectfully submit incorrectly and inappropriately, refer to the members of the tribunal as nominee of one party, the nominee of the other party. Once the nomination process is completed, the nominator becomes irrelevant so far as the arbitrator is concerned. The arbitrator is the judge to decide the dispute between the parties, and the fact that the arbitrator has been nominated by one of the parties is of no relevance going forward. Therefore, the first and foremost aspect of nominating an arbitrator is to decide what should be the qualifications of an arbitrator. It is said that an arbitration is only as good as its arbitrators. If you have an arbitrator who has no knowledge of law or no knowledge of the industry in respect of which the dispute has started, no commercial thinking, then I think the arbitration will end in a fiasco, independent of who succeeds in arbitration or who does not succeed in arbitration. Ultimately, what is important for all of us who have a stake in the institution of arbitration is not who succeeds in the arbitration. It is, more importantly, the process of arbitration which should command credibility. There is a responsibility that is cast on the various stakeholders, namely the arbitrators, the parties, and the lawyers, to ensure that the institution of arbitration in India gets a good name. And if all of us do not strive in that direction, I am afraid any amount of written law will not yield the result. The first and foremost step in the matter of an arbitration process is the constitution of the arbitral tribunal. Arbitral tribunal, in my view, should be comprised of persons who are knowledgeable in the field in respect of which the dispute has arisen. In other words, what is called as domain expertise. Out of personal experience, I may tell you that I did an arbitration before a panel comprising of 3 architects, and the dispute arose out of a wrong design of a load factor on a portico which was under construction in a multi-storied building, and on account of a excess load of the muck that was put on the portico collapsed, resulting in a great damage to the building. On account of it, the contractor claimed damages. The contractor claimed that the mishap occurred not because of his negligence, but because of the fact that the design and the load factor that had been provided in the design was incorrect. It was so easy before the arbitral tribunal to tell them as to what the problem was. And the first thing the arbitrators told us was, do not let in any evidence on the technicalities of the matter, because we know the technicalities. We know all these requirements in construction and engineering contracts. Just tell us the facts and leave it to us. And what would otherwise have taken days and days of argument and explanation took hardly a few hours. For all that we need to tell the arbitral tribunal was about the facts of the case, and they knew what technical principles had to be applied in order to come to a just conclusion. Similarly, we may have a dispute arising out of a complicated patent. As you know, patent is not simply law. Patent has intrinsically built into it lot of technicalities with respect to the product and the process under which the product is manufactured, for which a patent has been obtained. In a dispute arising out of a patent action, these are just examples I am placing for your consideration. In a dispute arising out of patent action, it is always admissible to have an arbitrator who is knowledgeable in the field. It could be information technology, it could be a product that is being manufactured, it could be in the pharma sector. In all these situations, I think a very important consideration is to have an arbitrator who is an expert in the domain. The second aspect which has to be provided for in the agreement, according to me, is to provide for a minimum qualification for an arbitrator. As you may be aware, under the law, there is no qualification required to be an arbitrator. It is just left to the parties to choose whomsoever they want, or left to the appointing authority to appoint whomsoever the appointing authority thinks is fit to be an arbitrator. For example, if an arbitration is to be held in India, it is sensible to have a tribunal comprising of members at least from within the country, so that the cost factor is also mitigated so far as the parties are concerned. Similarly, if the arbitration is to be conducted in a particular language, be it English or be it in any other language, then it is important that the arbitrator should be knowledgeable in that language, especially where the correspondence or the documents are in a foreign language. That may be a very important criteria to be taken into account before an arbitrator is selected. The next aspect is with respect to the law governing a particular contract. There might be an international commercial arbitration where the contract may be executed in one country. The two parties may belong to two different countries, and there could be the law of a third country which governs the contract. There may be a different law which governs the arbitration. There may be a different law as a curial law. In a situation of this kind, it is important that one of the criteria to be looked into before an arbitrator is appointed is to find out the international exposure that a particular person has before he or she is appointed as an arbitrator. Now, is there a directory of arbitrators from where one can choose? The answer is yes, if it is an institutional arbitration. The answer is no, if it is an ad hoc arbitration. So how does one therefore choose an arbitration if it is an ad hoc arbitration? If it is an ad hoc arbitration, the inquiry actually is ad hoc. The lawyers owe a duty to the clients, the lawyers owe a duty to the institution of arbitration to speak to their peers who might have had occasion to deal with similar matters and ask their opinions as to the expertise of a particular person and the recommendation that they would make. This is commonly done amongst leading law firms, where there is an exchange of notes about arbitrators and the experiences they have had with arbitrators, both national and international. It is also important that while appointing an arbitrator, one should have consideration for the age and health of the arbitrator. For the simple reason that if in the course of arbitration, an arbitrator should become incapacitated on account of ill health or expires, then the whole process of arbitration gets delayed, and there will be additional expenditure that one will have to incur to have a substitute arbitrator appointed. In addition, the quality of the process will suffer, for the new arbitrator will not have the benefit of personally being present and participating in the proceedings that have already taken place before he or she was appointed as an arbitrator. The next relevant factor which should be taken into account, and I shall deal with it a little more elaborately when I come to the provisions of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, is with regard to the existence of any justifiable grounds as to the independence or partiality of an arbitrator. As to what are these grounds, and how does one come to a conclusion as to whether there are justifiable grounds with respect to the partiality or independence of an arbitrator, I shall advert to a little in detail after all these, after we have crossed the stage of drafting an arbitration clause. The parties must also ensure that the arbitrator who they are intending to appoint, and the arbitration clause itself, should be available in terms of time in order to complete the arbitration process within a particular time frame. We have had instances where busy arbitrators are not able to complete the arbitration in time. We shall now keep section 12 capital A aside for the minute. Arbitrators are not able to spend time because of the excessive load of work that they have, or arbitrators are not able to deliver the award for months on end because of accumulated pressure of work. These are various factors that one has to keep in mind, even at this time when the arbitration clause is being drafted. For the parties are in command of the agreement. They can provide in the agreement anything which they think is in the interest of both the parties. It is therefore imperative that when arbitration clauses are drafted, we do not simply provide, as is unfortunately normally done, that the arbitration shall be, any dispute may be referred to an arbitrator, a sole arbitrator, or to an arbitral tribunal comprising of 3 arbitrators, one to be appointed by each of the parties, and the 2 arbitrators to appoint a 3rd arbitrator who will be the presiding arbitrator. This is a standard clause that one will find in an arbitration agreement. In my view, this is insufficient in order to protect the interest of the parties and promote the institution of arbitration as an alternate dispute mechanism. Now, an arbitration, it is said, has rests on 4 pillars. And what are those 4 pillars on which an arbitration rests? And let us now look at that. And in fact, it has been set out by the Supreme Court following a English judgment. Ramya, can you please get me that voestalpine versus DMRC judgment, please? Yes, if we will kindly look at the judgment, and more particularly paragraph number 19 of that judgment. Paragraph 19, 19. Yes, next page, next. Yes, next page. Yes. Now let's stop here. Now please look at the quote. The first and paramount principle of the first pillar, there are 4 pillars as you will see on top of this page. The first pillar are the 3 general principles. The second pillar is the general duty of the tribunal. The third pillar is the general duty of the parties. The fourth pillar is the mandatory and semi-mandatory provisions. Can we just go to the previous page, please? Yes, previous page. Just kindly move up. Now just move up. A little more. No, little more. Let's go back to the page which we were looking at. The first pillar, and you will see that these 4 pillars have been set out by Mustill and Boyd in the commentary on commercial arbitration. And these 4 pillars are the 3 general principles. The second pillar is the general duty of the tribunal. The third pillar is the general duty of the parties. And the fourth pillar is the mandatory and semi-mandatory provisions. Now, what are these 3 pillars? If you will just go up a little bit. In the book of O.P. Malhotra. Yes. In the book of O.P. Malhotra. Just go down. Yes, little more. Yeah, that's fine. In the book of O.P. Malhotra on the law of practice, it is rightly observed that Indian Arbitration Act is also based on the aforesaid 4 foundational pillars. And what is the most important pillar? The most important pillar is the first pillar, namely that fair, speedy, and inexpensive and fair trial by an impartial tribunal. That is the most critical aspect of it. Please look at it. Speedy, inexpensive, and fair trial by an impartial tribunal is the first pillar on which is the first of the 3 general principles on which the arbitration rests. The second one is party autonomy, and the third one is minimum court intervention. These are the 3 general principles which are called as the first pillar of arbitration. Now, when we come to the selection of arbitrator or the criteria for the selection of arbitrators, one has to ensure that the arbitrator is able to conduct the arbitration in a fair manner, in a speedy manner, once it is speedy, it becomes inexpensive, consistent with the second principle of these first pillar, namely party autonomy. While it is accepted that arbitration is driven by the parties and it is a voluntary process, the fact remains that while the parties provide in the agreement about the arbitrator and the choice of arbitrators, the parties must ensure that the arbitration is conducted in a fair manner, in a speedy manner, in an inexpensive manner, and by a tribunal which is impartial. This is what is required to be provided in an arbitration agreement. in exercise of what the law calls as party autonomy. And if this is taken care of, then automatically there will be minimum court intervention, which is the third of the general principles under the first pillar of arbitration. This has to be taken care of very carefully when an arbitration clause is drafted, and not a general arbitration clause as we normally find in the contracts that are drafted. Now, having pointed this out, there are a few things that one has to keep in mind with respect to the conduct of arbitration and the criteria for appointment of an arbitrator. There are 4 important factors that one has to keep in mind while appointing an arbitrator, or even possibly while drafting an arbitration agreement. 1, the arbitrator must have what is called as a manageable caseload. And these are the 4 factors that have been stated by Russell in his treatise on arbitration. Ensure that the arbitrator has a manageable caseload. Second, ensure that the arbitrator has a domain expertise. 3, and this becomes very important with respect to international commercial arbitration between 2 different nationalities. Ensure that the arbitrator is a person of neutral nationality. These are things that we need to provide in the arbitration agreement itself. And very importantly, an arbitrator, in order to be efficient as an arbitrator with a view to ensure speedy and inexpensive process of arbitration, must have strong managerial skills. The arbitrator must be able to manage the case, deal with the merits of the case. The arbitrator must be able to manage with the witnesses. The arbitrator must be able to manage the counsels. The arbitrator must be able to manage the parties. In other words, it is a very complex technique of management which the arbitrator will have to bring to bear on the entire process in order that it can be fair, speedy, and inexpensive. And how the arbitrator will do this without trampling upon the rights of the parties is really the skill of an arbitrator, and that's very important. Now, coming to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, we started from an extreme position of party autonomy, and independent of whatever may be the independence or the partisan attitude of a arbitrator as provided for under the agreement or as provided for as an appointment process under the agreement, the court took the view that once you have entered into an agreement, there is nothing more that can be done about it. And the first judgment on this point, which I would like to place for your consideration, is the judgment of the Supreme Court in Indian Oil Corporation versus Raja Transport. In the matter of appointing an arbitrator, there are 2 distinct silos. One is the factual silo, which is in the control of the party. The other is the legal silo, which states that in spite of whatever the parties might have said, the law is this. As you know, under the Indian Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, the procedure for appointment of an arbitrator where the parties are not able to agree upon whose arbitrator should be is left under section 11 to, before the amendment it was Chief Justice or his designate, and now it is by the Supreme Court or the High Court. Invariably, in contracts entered into between public bodies and a private individual, you will have an arbitration clause which provides that an officer of the public body will be the arbitrator, or some officer who is nominated by that public body or by that officer of the public body will be the arbitrator. In other words, the arbitration was denuded largely of the first prerequisite for arbitration, namely independence and impartiality. Independence and impartiality of a judge or an arbitrator is not something which is objective. It is subjective. It is not what the judge or the arbitrator himself thinks as to whether he or she is independent or not independent. It is what is a perception in the mind of a third party or of the party who is in front of the arbitrators with the dispute. In the case of Indian Oil Corporation of Raja Transport, as I said, the clause provided that Indian Oil Corporation, the managing director could appoint, the director marketing could appoint the arbitrator. Contrary to this clause, when the matter went before the Chief Justice of the High Court under section 11, the Chief Justice appointed a retired High Court judge as an arbitrator. This was questioned. Now please look at where the law started, and I will take you through how the law has now changed having regard to what has been set out as the guidelines by the International Bar Association, the IBA guidelines. I will come to it a little later. Now please look at para 13 of the judgment in Raja Transport. The court noticed at para 13, yes. The court noticed in Raja Transport at paragraph number 13 that arbitration is a binding voluntary alternate dispute resolution process by a private forum chosen by the parties. It is quite common for governments, statutory corporations and public sector undertakings, while entering into contracts, to provide for settlement of disputes by arbitration, and further provide that the arbitrator will be one of its senior officers. If a party, now look at where the laws, where it started. If a party with open eyes and full knowledge and comprehension of the said provision enters into a contract with the government or statutory corporation, public sector undertaking containing an arbitration agreement providing that one of its secretaries, directors shall be the arbitrator, he cannot subsequently turn around and contend that he is agreeable for settlement of disputes by arbitration, but not by the named party who is an employee of the other party. No party can say he will be bound by only one part of the agreement and not the other part. And on this reasoning, namely party autonomy, the Supreme Court set aside the order appointing a retired judge as an arbitrator and said, you have to go by the arbitration clause. But having said that, the Supreme Court noticed two exceptions to this rule of party autonomy and adherence to the arbitration clause. The one exception is contained in paragraph number 34 of the very same judgment. I'm just pointing out the incongruity in the reasoning of the Supreme Court. While on the one hand they said party autonomy and then emphasized the importance of committing parties to an arbitration agreement, but when it came to carving out exception, the Supreme Court said in paragraph number 34, the exception to this rule is where the fact that the named arbitrator is an employee of one of the parties is not ipso facto a ground to raise a presumption of bias or partiality or lack of independence on his part. There can, however, be a justifiable apprehension about the independence or impartiality of an employee arbitrator if such person was controlling or dealing authority in regard to subject contract, or if he is a direct subordinate to the officer whose decision is the subject matter of the dispute. Second exception was carved out, and even there, in my respectful submission, it doesn't stand to too much of reason. Please be kind enough to look at paragraph number 36 of the very same judgment. The position may be different, where the person named as arbitrator is an employee of a company or body or individual other than the state and its instrumentalities. For example, if a director of a private company, which is a party to the arbitration agreement, is named as arbitrator, there may be a valid and reasonable apprehension of bias in view of his position and interest, and he may be unsuitable to act as arbitrator in an arbitration involving the company. I shall stop for a moment here and point out that the reason is that there is likely to be lack of independence, there is likely to be a lack of being objective, and there may be an apprehension that he may be partial and not impartial. How this apprehension vanishes in the case of a public sector undertaking or a government is hard to fathom, but this is where the law began. Fortunately, much water has flown under the bridge after Raja Transport. Now let us go to what happened after Raja Transport. After the decision of the Supreme Court in Raja Transport, the Law Commission of India looked at the entire matter in the context of a hue and cry that had been raised that in government contracts there was this apprehension of lack of independence and lack of impartiality because of the way the arbitration clauses were worded, and virtually the other party was not in a bargaining position. The Law Commission looked at it in its 246th report and relied upon the IBA guidelines of 2014. The IBA guidelines of 2014 set out certain very important principles, and I shall briefly refer to it before we go into the other provisions. The first principle that has been set out is at page 4 of the IBA guidelines. Yes. Kindly look at the first general principle. Every arbitrator shall be impartial and independent of the parties at the time of accepting an appointment to serve, and shall remain so until the final award has been rendered or the proceedings have otherwise finally terminated. That is the first principle set out in the IBA guidelines. Now let us go to the second principle over the page at page 5. Having said this, the next question was, when can an arbitrator be said to have conflict of interest? An arbitrator should decline to accept an appointment, or if the arbitration has already been commenced, refuse to continue to act as an arbitrator if he or she has any doubt as to his or her ability to be impartial or independent. And when can a justifiable doubt about the independence or impartiality of an arbitrator arises was not mentioned till the amendment was effected in 2016 to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, though there were provisions in the 1996 Act as amended with respect to this matter. The crucial point which I would like to point out is, please look at the explanation to this general standard at the bottom of this page. If the arbitrator, this is the high standard that is required by an arbitrator, and I will point out what is the standard that is required even by a party. Because unless everybody acts in concert, it is not possible to come up with a robust arbitration institution in this country. Because we have to think beyond the interest of the party. We as practitioners have to think beyond the particular case in which we are engaged. Arbitrators have to think beyond the particular arbitration which they are conducting, because ultimately everything has an impact on the reputation of the institution and the object of making India as a favorite destination for arbitration. Now look at this. If the arbitrator has doubts as to his or her ability to be impartial and independent, the arbitrator must decline the appointment. This standard should apply regardless of the stage of the proceedings. This is a basic principle that is spelled out in these guidelines in order to avoid confusion and to foster confidence in the arbitral process. Now, how do you come to a conclusion as to whether there are reasonable or as to whether there are justifiable grounds to question the impartiality or independence of an arbitrator? The test is a reasonable third-person test. Please look at that. It's mentioned in that clause B, because it is Article 12 of the UNCITRAL rules. The same principle applies. If you will see in B at page 6, in order for standards to be applied as consistently as possible, can you just go down, please? Yes. In order for standards to be applied as consistently as possible, the test for disqualification is an objective one. The words impartiality or independence derives from the widely adopted Article 12 of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, and the use of an appearance test based on verifiable doubts as to the impartiality or independence of the arbitrator as provided in Article 22 of the UNCITRAL model law is to be applied objectively, a reasonable third-person test. What would a third person think of the conduct? What would the third person think of these factors? In spite of these factors, would a third person think that the arbitrator is impartial or independent? If the answer is no, the arbitrator must recuse. Whatever the arbitrator may think about it. In fact, now please go over to the next page, very important rule. If you will go to D, yes, any doubt as to whether an arbitrator should disclose certain facts or circumstances should be resolved in favor of disclosure. Suppose the arbitrator, there are certain facts which the arbitrator thinks may or may not have any impact on the impartiality or his or her independence. What should the arbitrator do? Just not disclose? No. On the contrary, if there is a doubt as to whether a particular fact has a bearing on impartiality or independence, it is a duty of the arbitrator to disclose it. Therefore, it should be resolved in favor of disclosure. Then please look at what the parties must do. In fact, there is an obligation under the IBA for the counsel also to disclose if there is any fact which is within his or her knowledge which may throw some reasonable doubt on the independence or impartiality of the arbitrator. Therefore, the duty is not only on the arbitrator, the duty is on the counsel too. If the counsel does come to know that even their own nominee is likely not to be independent or is likely not to be impartial, then there is a duty on the part of the counsel to make a disclosure. These guidelines provide for factors which cast a doubt on the impartiality or independence of an arbitrator and put it under 3 lists. One is called the red list, which is waivable. The second is called the red list, which is not waivable. The second list is the orange list, and the third one is the green list. Red list was a clear no-no unless it was waived. Orange, maybe, may not be. Gray area. Green, no problem. Now, drawing inspiration from the guidelines laid down by the International Bar Association, which was on 23rd of October 2014, the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996 was amended by Amendment Act number 3 of 2016. Extensive amendments were made. And the crucial amendment which is relevant for the purpose of the present discussion are the amendment made to section 12. Most importantly, section 12 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act for the first time introduced the concept of the red list and orange list. We did not take this green list. Orange list, and we also did not make the distinction between waivable and not waivable because a separate provision was made. In the amendment that was effected, certain factors were mentioned or certain circumstances were mentioned which were set out in the 5th schedule, which an arbitrator had to disclose as likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence or impartiality. That is the 5th schedule. The following grounds give rise to justifiable doubts as to the independence or impartiality of arbitrators. Now, when an arbitrator is likely to fall within one or more of the items specified in the 5th schedule, then the arbitrator was bound to make a disclosure in writing under section 12(1) of the Amendment Act. When a person is approached in connection with his possible appointment as an arbitrator, he shall disclose in writing circumstances which is likely to give rise to justifiable doubts as to his independence or impartiality, and that was set out in Schedule 5 as per the explanation number 1. Once this is disclosed, then there is a challenge procedure prescribed under section 13. The parties can say, well, having regard to the facts that you have set out, please recuse yourself, we don't want you as an arbitrator. The arbitrator can then decide as to whether the grounds are sufficient for him to recuse himself, or he can still continue. And if he still continues, that can be one of the grounds of challenge under section 34 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, where if an award is passed, it can be challenged. The more important aspect are the grounds set out in the 7th schedule. That is the schedule which provides for what is called as ineligibility. Please look at the provisions of section 12(5) of the Amended Act. Notwithstanding any prior agreement to the contrary, any person whose relationship with the parties or counsel or the subject matter dispute falls under any of the categories specified in the 7th schedule shall be ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator. Therefore, this was a clear no so far as a person to be appointed as an arbitrator under the Amendment Act. The question arose, very interestingly, what is to happen if there is a provision in the agreement for an arbitrator to be appointed by, say, a managing director of a particular party or by his nominee. Managing director was ineligible to be appointed as an arbitrator because of the bar contained in the 7th schedule. The question arose as to whether a person who is ineligible to be an arbitrator himself can nominate somebody else who may not be ineligible under the 7th schedule or who may not attract any of the circumstances mentioned in the 5th schedule. This question came up for consideration before the Supreme Court in TRF versus Energy Engineering Projects. And interestingly, the Supreme Court take a very broad view. Now the law has marched from Raja Transport to look at the march of the law from Raja Transport to TRF Limited. Please look at paragraph 50 of this judgment. As I indicated, this was a case where the agreement provided that the arbitrator shall be appointed by the managing director of one party, or the arbitration will be conducted by the managing director of that party or by a nominee of that party, of the managing director. And now look at what the Honorable Supreme Court said in paragraph number 50. Para 50. First, we shall deal with clause D. There is no quarrel that by virtue of section 12(5) of the Act, if any person who falls under any of the categories specified in the 7th schedule shall be ineligible to be appointed as arbitrator, there is no doubt and cannot be, for the language employed in the 7th schedule, the managing director of the corporation has become ineligible by operation of law. It is the stand of the learned senior counsel for the appellant that once the managing director becomes ineligible, he also becomes ineligible to nominate. So the contention was that you could not have done it, therefore you cannot also nominate. Now please see what the Honorable Supreme Court said at the bottom. But here is a case where the managing director is the named sole arbitrator, and he has also been conferred with the power to nominate one who can be the arbitrator. Thus, there is a subtle distinction, and having pointed it out, the Supreme Court in paragraph number 54 said, in such a context, the fulcrum of the controversy would be, can an ineligible arbitrator like the managing director nominate an arbitrator who may be otherwise eligible and a respectable person? As stated earlier, we are neither concerned with the eligibility, the objectivity, nor the individual respectability. We are only concerned with the authority or the power of the managing director. By our analysis, we are obligated to arrive at the conclusion that once the arbitrator has become ineligible by operation of law, he cannot nominate another as an arbitrator. So, if there is a disqualification that has been incurred under the 7th schedule, then the question of that person nominating somebody else as an arbitrator also was ruled out. The law swung to the other side. Then comes another very interesting judgment of the Supreme Court. That is the judgment in Bharat Broadband. What happened in this case was, the question that arose was, an arbitrator who was ineligible under Schedule 7 conducted the arbitration proceedings, parties participated in arbitral proceedings, and award also was passed. Then the question arose as to whether, not having taken recourse to the challenge procedure under Section 13, could a party say, no, still the arbitrator could not have been an arbitrator having regard to the disqualification under Schedule 7, and therefore any action taken by him, any award passed by him is a nullity. Supreme Court upheld that contention. The Supreme Court said that The challenge procedure contemplated under Section 7 is only where there are any circumstances referred to in Section 12(3). Now, the circumstances referred to in Section 12(3) of the Arbitration Act was only giving rise to justifiable doubts as to independence or impartiality, or that he does not possess the qualification as required under the arbitration agreement. These are the only two grounds which are covered in a challenge procedure under Section 13. So far as Section 12(5) is concerned, with reference to the disqualification under Schedule 7, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the arbitrator was de jure, not an arbitrator. And therefore, the question of having recourse to Section 13 did not arise. And in that context, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that all the action that had been taken by the arbitrator was nullity, and even the award was set aside. In this context, it is relevant to also have a look at Section 14. When does the mandate of an arbitral tribunal terminate? The mandate of an arbitral tribunal terminates if he becomes de jure or de facto unable to perform his functions, or for other reasons fails to act without undue delay. Now, this is the amendment that was introduced by the 2016 Act. The mandate of an arbitrator shall terminate if he becomes de jure unable to perform his functions. Now, if an arbitrator therefore becomes de jure unable to perform his functions by virtue of absolute prohibition introduced under the 7th schedule, then the proceedings before that arbitrator is unhonest. So you will see that the law with regard to the qualification of the arbitrator moved from complete party autonomy, as in Raja Transport, to broadband, where the court said, sorry, if you are ineligible, nothing can be done about it. All this was based upon the IBA guidelines and the amendments made to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, which mandated that there should be independence, there should be impartiality. Having done this, there are, very interestingly, the Supreme Court introduced a concept called counterbalancing. Counterbalancing in the context of a multi-member arbitration, a three-party arbitration. In fact, it will be useful for me to refer to a recent judgment of the Supreme Court in Central Organization for Railway Electrification, which was a judgment delivered on the 17th of December 2019. Here, the arbitration clause provided that the employer, which was a government body, will provide to the other party a list of 5 names. Out of the 5 names, the contractor is entitled to choose 1 arbitrator. Out of the 4 remaining names, the employer is entitled to choose 1 arbitrator. The 2 nominated arbitrators will have to choose a presiding arbitrator from amongst the remaining 3. This was the clause. Now, if we apply the ratio of the judgment of the Supreme Court in Voestalpine or TRF, all this becomes such a clause of this kind, and especially in the context of Schedule 7, Section 12(5), all this becomes illegal. You can never have an arbitration clause like this. But the Supreme Court, in my view, the reasoning is not acceptable, came up with a very interesting principle of counterbalancing. They said, look, such a clause is nothing wrong about it, because anyway, from the same pool of 5 people who the employer is suggesting, the contractor has to pick up one arbitrator. The employer picks up the other arbitrator, and the employer and the 2 people pick up the third arbitrator from among the remaining 3. Look at the counterbalancing argument that was accepted by the Supreme Court. If you will kindly see para 37 of this judgment. I think we have taken one step back. We were at one end of the spectrum, we went to the other end of the spectrum, which is right, and now we have taken one step back. It is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. And now look at para 37. Clause 64(3)(b) of GCC deals with appointment of arbitrator, where applicability of section 12(5) of the Act has not been waived off. In terms of 64(3)(b), the arbitral tribunal consists of a panel of 3 retired railway personnel not below the rank of so and so. For this purpose, Railway will send a panel of at least 4 names of retired railway officers empaneled to work as arbitrators, indicating the retirement date to the contractor within 60 days. The contractor will be asked to suggest the general manager at least 2 names out of the panel for appointment of contractor's nominee within 30 days from the date of dispatch of the request. General manager shall appoint at least 1 out of them as a contractor's nominee and will simultaneously appoint the remaining arbitrators from among the 3 arbitrators. The remaining 3, 1 from the contractor, 1 from the employer, and the presiding arbitrator from the remaining 3. The exercise of appointing arbitral tribunal shall be completed within 30 days from the receipt of the contractors. Thus, now this is the reasoning. Thus, by respondent's power to choose any 2 from out of the 4 names, and the general manager shall appoint at least 1 out of 3 out of them as the Thus, the exercise of appointing arbitral tribunal shall be completed in 30 days from the receipt of names of contractors' nominees. Thus, the right of the general manager in formation of arbitral tribunal is counterbalanced by the respondent's power to choose any 2 from out of the 4 names, and the general manager shall appoint at least 1 out of them as the contractor's nominee. Now, how does this stand to logic? The fact that the names came from one of the parties, and the other party to the contract is compelled to choose 1 from among the names suggested, and the presiding arbitrator is also to be from among the list that has been sent by one of the parties, without giving complete freedom to the 2 nominated arbitrators to choose the 3rd arbitrator. A clause like this was upheld. And now look at the last 3 lines at para 38. Since the respondent has been given the power to select 2 names from out of the 4 names of the panel, the power of the appellant nominating its arbitrator gets counterbalanced by the power of choice given to the respondent. Thus, the power of the general manager to nominate the arbitrator is counterbalanced by the power of the respondent to select any of the 2 nominees from out of the 4 names suggested from the panel of retired officers. In view of the modified clauses, etc., it cannot therefore be said that the general manager has become ineligible to act as arbitrator. We do not find any merit in the contrary contention of the respondent. Now, the whole object of introducing Schedule 7, the underlying principle, the first principle that was initiated by the International Bar Association, which has been accepted by the Law Commission and made into a statute, is that the fundamental premises is that the arbitral tribunal must be independent and impartial. Parties must have autonomy to appoint whomsoever they want as their arbitrators, subject to the qualifications that may be specified in the arbitration agreement. When I ask myself, is there a provision for a unilateral appointment of this kind, which was held to be bad in the earlier judgments, to be sustained merely because of some counterbalancing principles? This counterbalancing principle is something that is not found, in my view, in the Arbitration Act. And therefore, according to me, this judgment of the Supreme Court in Central Organization for Railway Electrification requires a serious second look. Now that I have placed all these aspects for your consideration, I shall conclude by simply pointing out that all of us have a duty to make this institution of arbitration a robust institution in the country, and that will be impossible unless parties have complete confidence in the arbitration process. Arbitration process has to be very robust if one has to promote the institution of arbitration in this country. If that does not happen, and if we are not able to provide a robust institution which is based upon independence, upon impartiality, upon competence, and with a view to complete arbitration proceedings in a time-bound and inexpensive manner, which can happen only when there is a competent arbitral tribunal, I am afraid that the wish of making India a destination for arbitration will simply remain on paper and will not become practical. Thank you very much for providing me this opportunity of setting forth before you the factual aspects which is in the control of the parties with respect to the criteria for allotment, for appointment of an arbitrator, and the legal requirements with respect to the appointment of arbitrators. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a few questions if you're willing to answer them, not
Sure.
too many.
Sure.
So the first one is from Mr. Georges Hanot. He says, what is your opinion on the possible advantages of arbitrators that are also trained as mediators and that may operate in a hybrid med-arb modus in order to first try to lead parties to a jointly reached agreement before, if the latter is unsuccessful, impose their own adjudication?
Personally, I would not recommend a mediator to be an arbitrator. Whatever may be the ultimate decision that the arbitrator, who has also acted as a mediator, may take, however just the conclusion of the arbitrator may be, having failed in the mediation process, still there is a lurking fear or a lurking feeling in the mind of the losing party that something that was disclosed in the process of mediation has weighed in the mind of the arbitrator in the matter of interpreting the evidence or appreciating the relevance of that evidence. Therefore, I personally would think that a mediator should not be an arbitrator if the mediation fails.
Thank you, sir. There's another insight, I think. This isn't really a question, but it's by Mr. Pratap Pogulakonda. He says that I solicit more interpretation on the judgment rendered in Perkins' case insofar as party autonomy in appointing the arbitrators is concerned vis-a-vis the report of the Law Commission of India and the qualifications contemplated in Schedule 7 of the Act. I think he was just adding to your insight. Yes. And there's another question from Ms. Sangeeta Mehrotra. She says, at the end of the day, isn't it desirable that self-regulation is much more important while accepting an arbitration?
I agree with this 100%. Ultimately, a judge or an arbitrator must have his or her conscience as his or her master.
Thank you, sir. Are there any other questions? I think that's about it, but we'll just wait for a minute in case there are any other questions. Participants, feel free to put in your questions if you have any. Like Mr. Shiv Kumar has a question. I'll try and see if I can get him to speak. I've enabled Mr. Shiv Kumar's audio so he can ask the question orally. Yes, sir, you may go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Raghavan, as usual, it was a brilliant exposition of the law. And there has never been a single instance where you have not lived up to your reputation as a brilliant and erudite advocate.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Having said that, almost all of what you said in terms of the quality of the arbitrator, the need to reveal his interests, if any, the provision for Section 12, etc. All these relate to the personal value system and ethical value system of an arbitrator. I don't know whether law can control those ethics. Ethics is a product of the circumstance under which we've been brought up. And to expect an arbitrator to reveal or state that he is likely to be unbiased, to be biased, seems a little far-fetched unless we are able to develop a class of people whom, as you mentioned, conscience are their masters. How do we tackle that problem?
Mr. Shivkumar, that is something that has to be cultivated. It is what you may call as the culture of the society. But one cannot, when you're dealing with a legal aspect, simply leave everything up in the air. And therefore, there are some regulations that are required to be provided by the concerned statute. And that is what the amendment did by introducing the 5th and the 7th schedules.
So I have no problem with that. You're perfectly all right. I'm in agreement with that. It only substantiates my point that law may not be able to control ethical standards.
Absolutely.
I'm saying what are your thoughts on creating a band of people whose credibility and ethical standards are beyond question?
Well, it is very difficult to create from outside. One has to create that from within.
So it's back to us.
Yes, it is back to everybody. It is back to the arbitrators. It is back in the ball of the lawyers. Every one of us has to pitch in order to make this system a credible system.
All right, second question. I'm sorry, I'm asking one more. To a stranger who wants to appoint an arbitrator arising out of an arbitration clause in a contract, there is no way we are able to gauge or understand the ethical standards of arbitrator. It's only when you get into it you begin to realize that the arbitrator is either biased or he's not what is expected. See, these are practical on-the-ground difficulties we have when we draft contracts.
True. That is why I don't think anywhere in the world there is a method by which you can ascertain accurately what the standing of the arbitrator is with respect to his or her independence or impartiality. It is therefore necessary that you do a moral search amongst your peers in the industry and find out the reputation of the person. And it is only on that basis that an arbitrator can be chosen with a reasonable certainty that he or she will be impartial or independent. In fact, in certain jurisdictions, parties and their counsel interview prospective arbitrators to find out their thinking. Another way of doing it is to find out if the arbitrator has a policy bias. Some arbitrators are pro-establishment, some are anti-establishment. Read their earlier judgments. If they are judges, see how they reacted when they were judges and wrote judgments. See if there are other awards that they have passed, taking a particular view on a particular legal point that may arise. These are various ways in which one can reasonably make an effort to ascertain who and what is the caliber and thinking of the arbitrator. There is no foolproof mechanism for this.
Thank you, sir. There's one final question that we'll take up because I think we are running short of time. This one's from Mr. Pushkar Keshav Murthy. He wants to know your thoughts on the advantages and role of institutional arbitration in making the appointment process more efficient in terms of ethics, impartiality, and independence.
Yes, I think in institutional arbitration plays a very vital role in ensuring that arbitrators who are appointed are independent and impartial. Because institutions not only keep control of the arbitration at the beginning, they also keep control of the proceedings as it goes on. And the arbitral tribunals they are constituted by institutions on the basis of certain set guidelines. And in fact, one of the important things that many institutions do is to appoint to maintain what is called as neutrality of arbitrators. Neutrality is not only in terms of nationality, but also in terms of disclosures as to their connection with the parties, the councils, or the subject matter of the arbitration. It is only thereafter, when the disclosure is made, that the institution appoints the arbitrators.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of BIMAC and on my own behalf, I'd like to thank you so much for your time this evening. I think this has been a very, very useful session for all of us, and we have all learned a lot. I'd also like to thank the Society of Indian Law Firms for promoting this event as well. Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure having you and listening to you talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank all the participants for joining in.